All right, everybody. This is going to be a special one. I asked my partner, my mentor, and my friend Louis Marks of Rope It Up Records to let me do the introduction for this one-time thing. The reason is that our guest today is to say that he's extra special to my heart would be a gross understatement. His playing and his music is really kind of like the soundtrack of my youth, my coming together into whatever it is that I'm trying to be today. But I've learned over the years that whatever it is music that shapes you when you're super young, it kind of remains with you for life. You whatever records that you listen to, um, when you're kind of like a kid with the posters on the wall, you would dream of having a Les Paul in your hands. Those those albums, they have a way of always grabbing you emotionally, and one of those for me was Mad Season. And then I went on, I was a kid, but I was trying to learn as much as I could about those people behind it. And I followed them and their career as that progressed, for me as fan, really, and for them as legends. So without further ado, I, I'd like to introduce you, Mr. Barrett Martin. Barrett, thanks for coming on board.
Oh, I'm honored to be here. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
We finally made it. We've been talking about this for 1 year or so. I mean,
Yeah, it was a long time.
oh my God. So we finally made it. So I have a lot of questions for you for today, but anything that doesn't make sense is disregard. The first would be, what's your first earliest? I'm cheating. In all this time that you had with COVID, before we jump into the talk,
Yeah.
all this time we have at home, a couple of records that you've been listening to that truly inspired you and you'd like to share with our fans, or
Oh, wow, that's a good question. Well, I actually am in the middle of producing an album for Joy Harjo, who is the current American Poet Laureate, which is a very important role to play. And every country has one. And I've been listening to her old records, which have this beautiful combination of spoken word poetry and singing. And this is a very interesting way to approach music, is the idea of literal poems as a way to speak and sing. So that's influenced me quite a bit. I've
hmm.
been going backwards in time and listening to people like Gil Scott Heron,
ah,
because there's another guy that does a lot of poetry and um, but can also, makes it sounds like a song, but it's also a poem. And
if I already have you on the subject, the album
yes,
that you're producing for her, it's also a mixture of spoken word poetry and singing.
yes, it's both. And I'm taking that Gil Scott Heron approach to the
Can
production.
you give me some tips on pulling that off? Because I feel that to mix spoken word with singing on the same album, or mixing it with music, like there's a lot
Mhm.
of jazz that invite spoken word. That's
Yes.
super hard to pull off on an album. It seems to be a little more allowing, like live, but on an album, it seems to. I mean, any light that you can shed on this? Any?
Well, think about somebody like Leonard Cohen, for example, an incredible songwriter, and he was a singer, but he started as a poet, and a lot of his songs almost, I mean, they are spoken word with a slight amount of melody, but that melody that comes with natural speaking. So I think that, I mean, really it comes down to the individual artist, that how they use their voice. Some people just have a particularly beautiful way of speaking, and the way they speak, has a lyrical melodic quality to it. So you just bend it a little bit into the melodic realm and it sounds like singing, or you scale it back a little bit and it's spoken word, but it still sounds really, it's hypnotizing when it's done the right way.
Yeah, completely. It could be Leonard Cohen, it could be Rage Against the Machine. I completely agree with
That's
you,
right. That's
but
right.
it's
That
very
rage.
hard to
Yeah.
pull off. Very hard to pull off.
Yeah.
For
And,
my
and, no, but Rage Against the Machine is a great example, right? He's essentially spoken word, but with such fierce delivery that it's totally arresting. You know, it grabs you, and and in my opinion, the best of all time is Chuck D from Public Enemy. His
Ah,
voice, the timbre of his voice, the way it commands your attention. Like, you don't even know what he's going to say, but you have to listen because of the quality of his voice.
I remember being a teenager in Israel, and
Yeah,
not we're talking about being 10ish,
yeah,
and it's you just start English class in school, and I didn't even understand half the words. I mean, and half I'm being nice,
right.
but many times in music, and I wonder if that was like for you as an artist. You play concerts, there's lots of people, and I'm assuming that half the audience are not necessarily always singing, as you said, pre-internet. They're not always singing the right words,
Right.
but the sound of the vocalist or the
Yeah.
sound of the band, it grabs them so hard.
Well, I've played a lot of shows where there weren't a lot of people at my shows, so it's not
I
that
was
every
just
show but
I was just saying that I was playing to 30 people way before it was cool because of COVID. I mean,
right.
this is my specialty. What are you talking about?
But I want to say something about that, because that's a really good point you made. When I played in Brazil, and I've been in Brazil for, oh man, it's probably been, well, are we still recording? Because it looks like it froze. I think we are, hopefully. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you
Oh,
very
okay,
well.
good. Okay, good. I'll just keep talking. When I was working in Brazil, I was producing and touring down there with Nando Reis, who's a very well known Brazilian singer songwriter. His career goes back to the 1980s.
Are we talking about Nando?
Yeah, Nando. Yeah, but I was going to talk about how the audience participates. In all of my touring around the world, I've never seen so much audience participation as in Brazil. Like, they know the lyrics to every song, and they all sing every word exactly right with Nando when he's singing. Like, in fact, we would be laughing and these are big shows, you know, like many thousands of people, and we'd be playing, and he would start singing, and the audience is louder than anybody on stage, and that's a powerful experience, to experience that kind of participation.
Must be amazing.
Yeah,
It must
yeah,
be amazing. Um, Going back to what you said about Leonard Cohen, I worked with one of the guys that engineered him, and
yeah,
he said that no matter what he put in front of him, it always sounded like Leonard Cohen. I mean, it's just that
yeah,
strength of that voice and that character.
yeah. Yeah, and my wife and I were just watching the Leonard Cohen documentary. It's about him and his muse. I think her name was Marianne. And that is an incredible documentary about the arc of his life. Um, and some singers just have that quality. And like, I'm remembering, for example, I worked with REM for a couple of years. Played in the band, played on a couple of records, and Michael Stipe had that quality. And it was this thing where, like, he could just show up to the studio and sing the phone book, as they say, you know, and just sing
Wow,
just words, and it sounds incredible because of
wow, wow,
that
wow.
delivery, you know.
Yeah, the kind the vocalist that you work with, we'll be getting to that today. But I mean, um, so I'm going back to your earliest memories of falling in love with music. What was it like?
I have to say, I got it from my grandparents, because my grandparents had this collection of old '78 jazz records, and it was all, because, you know,
Ah,
yeah, the best stuff. And they're from the World War II generation. My grandfather was in World War II, and they were very young, and so all of their records were like big band and swing, and it was Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong and all that kind of music. And so
and
as a kid,
how old are you? How old are you when you were listening to this?
Oh, like all through my childhood, because my grandparents kind of raised me half the time. I spent half my time with my grandparents, half the time with my parents, because my parents were very young too. So I kind of got shuttled back and forth. So I got my grandparents' jazz influence, and then my dad listened to all the outlaw country. So like Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, and
Wow.
all of the classic outlaw, like the great country music that had that beautiful songwriting and production. And so I kind of had, it was not rock and roll. That's the irony. I hardly listened to rock and roll until I was in high school. So it was mostly jazz and outlaw country music were my two first
And
influences.
do you feel that those drummers, Joe Jones, Sid Campbell, those guys that played on those albums, did they influence your beat in a way, or your
I would
sound?
say, I would say it was the swing that they had. So it wasn't so much the physical technique of their drumming, it was like the feel of it. So the swing and the way they just sat there in the back pocket and kept the whole train going. That's
Yeah.
and that's how I approach drumming too. I can play all the fancy stuff, like I've been to music school, I know how to do that, but I don't find that to be as interesting as like merging with a band and like making whatever the song is going to be, making it as good as possible. And I remember going to a lecture by Hal Blaine, the great session
Yeah.
drummer from the Wrecking Crew, and he had a book out and he was doing a book tour. So I went to his talk, and he said, I remember it really clearly. He said, "Listen, you, there's lots of people that can play the fancy stuff all the time. What matters is that you find the song, what the soul of the song wants you to play, and you play that." And then
Yeah.
he said, "One shot in the right place makes all the difference. You just got to do like one cool thing, and that makes it."
I we kind of focus on this show with on music producers,
Okay,
and I'm also doing another one with just jazz artists.
right.
But and I always kind of wanted to, because I'm kind of using this situation to steal as much information from you as I can. This album is just out. I was just notified that it's in consideration for the Grammys in 4 categories, which to me is absurd. But I'm working on the next one, and I'm trying to learn as much as I can so I can make hopefully a leap between one to the other.
I was going to
And
say, one of the records I did listen to is that your new record that you just held up, because I listened to it a long time ago, and this is the truth. I'm
Barrett,
not.
this is not the time to lie. This is not.
No, this is the truth. When you first emailed me a long time ago, I remember I looked on Spotify, I found you, and I listened to that record, and it's beautiful. I love the way you use your guitar as a melodic instrument. It's gorgeous. It's really
That means so much. That means so much
beautiful.
to me.
Yeah, because if I could say anything about production, the most important thing is that you capture the spirit of the song and you record it well. There's a million ways you can do that, and they're all correct, but the most important is that you capture the spirit of the song, and I feel like you did that. It's a beautiful record.
That means so much to me. That means so much to me. But the truth is that this show is about the millions ways to capture it well and the 100 million ways to not get it right. you know.
Okay, that's a good
But
I like those parameters. I like it.
um, but I always wanted to learn about songs, because my music doesn't use lyrics. But I want to stay with people or stick with people somehow. And so songs are just a huge part of my life, and I always wanted to kind of get a chance to do the same kind of conversation with Duff McKagan.
Okay,
But
yeah.
I kind of imagine the conversation to be super short, because all I will ask will be, "Do you feel that what you guys did was about chemistry?" And he would say, "Yeah." And then I will say, "And how important was the song?" And he would say, "It was the most important thing." And it'll be the end of the thing.
Yeah.
So
Well, okay. So that let's talk about Duff, because that's somebody I've known Duff for about 25 years, and I was in a band with him called the Walking Papers,
of
starting in
course.
about 2011, I think, is when we recorded the first
Barrett,
album.
Barrett,
Yeah.
if you don't mind, let's save this for just a minute later,
Oh, okay,
if
sure.
you don't mind, because
Sure,
I already got you on a we already kind of so you were listening to jazz and to the Outlawed guys, and then you became a teenager
that's right.
and it shifted. What happened there?
Okay, so it was actually about when I was sort of like in 8th grade, so just about to start high school. My aunt, so I have this aunt, Aunt Mary, and she's about 10 or 12 years older than me. And so she was totally into rock and roll like when I was a little kid. So she gave me all of her rock and roll albums, and it was stuff like Elton John's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road,
Ah,
and I mean several Elton John records actually, because she was really into Elton John, and like a couple Rolling Stones records, one of which was Sticky Fingers, just because I remember that, you know, that album
cover.
cover. Yeah,
Yeah.
and then there was like a one or two Bob Dylan albums, and oh, and the Who, Tommy.
Ah,
That was one of the ones that I listened to a lot. So right before I started high school, I started listening to rock and roll, and then throughout high school, of course, then I was discovering Led Zeppelin and the Beatles, and I mean it was mostly, you know, classic British rock at that time, because this is in the late 70s, early 80s, where that stuff is still contemporary, right? The Beatles were still getting played on the radio all the time. The Who was still, you know, making records. Rolling Stones obviously were still making records, so it was very contemporary.
and Zeppelin are probably still bigger than God in the US or something.
Oh yeah, I mean, once I got into rock and rock drumming, John Bonham was my main influence.
I can really
Um,
hear that actually.
yeah,
That
and you
is
know,
super in the most beautiful way.
yeah, and it was really because he had that swing. You know, that's the thing about Bonham. You know, he did those incredible drum fills, and you know, if you listen to it enough, you can figure it out on your own. You know, you can just kind of
Of
intuitively
course.
figure out how to do it. But it was the swing, and swing is not something you can't even write swing on music. You just have
I'm
to write
so
the word.
happy you're saying this. I'm so
You just
happy you
yeah,
said
you just have to
that
write the
is
word swing.
exactly. And if you need that word, you're already in bad luck. But
That's that's
but
right.
if we talk about Bonham or Max Weinberg or you know, all those guys,
Yeah.
uh, you know what I mean? They all, you know what I mean? They all came out of jazz. All those
Yes, I
guys,
think they were all influenced by jazz. I think you're exactly
yeah,
right.
and especially the British guys. I mean,
Yeah.
Rolling Stones, almost all of them made some sort of jazz things in their lives.
I
Um,
think they're also heavily influenced by the blues. I mean,
yeah,
that's well known because they talked about it. But remember, at that same period of time in the United States, you have all this incredible soul and R&B, and the drumming on that stuff is super, like it's in the back pocket. It swings. You know, Al Jackson
insane.
Jr. on all those Stax records, and the
Yeah,
Funk Brothers on the Motown records. They all had that swing.
yeah. So you're a teenager and you're already practicing the drums, and at that point you're going to be a drummer.
Yeah, I had a drum set from the time that I was about maybe 9 or 10 years old. My dad bought a little jazz drum set at a garage sale, and I had it set up. I grew up on kind of a small farm, you know, out in the woods in Washington State, and so I had my drum set set up in the hayloft of the barn, you know, like literally in the hayloft. And so I would just go up there and I would practice, and then at some point I got a turntable, and I set up the turntable next to the drum set with like giant headphones, and I would just like play along with those jazz records and the rock records. I just liked a good song, you know. So it could be an instrumental song. You know, that's what's amazing about jazz is like a great melody makes the song. You don't necessarily have to have lyrics. You just need a good
Yeah.
melody. So I was playing along to instrumental music. I was playing to rock music. And of course, then I got into the progressive rock. So I'm, you know, learning how to play along with Neil Peart from Rush, and like Yes, and King Crimson was a big influence. Bill Bruford. So this is kind of all happening through high school. I'm merging my jazz and my rock, and just kind of figuring out how to play along with all the people I liked.
Unbelievable. So the first time that I heard you was with the band with Lane, but I'm sure there are more than a few before then. I mean, what were the initial steps of moving to Seattle and kind of getting into the scene?
Well, I really only played in before I did Mad Season with Lane and Mike McCready. I moved to Seattle in 1987. I was a music student and was at the University of Washington. But I was kind of having, I'd already been in school for 2 years. So this was like my third year in college. And I was really kind of not connecting with, studying music as opposed to playing music. I wasn't really getting to play live very much. I also wasn't the best jazz drummer in the music program. There were a lot of people better than me. I was just one of many students at that time. So I decided to take some time off, and I started auditioning for bands in Seattle. And this is in 1987. I played in an early punk rock band called the Thin Men, and we made one album that only came out as a cassette tape. It wasn't even, I don't even think people were really making CDs yet, but it was just a cassette. And then we did a couple songs that were produced by Jack Endino, the great producer who produced Nirvana and Soundgarden.
Of course.
And he produced a single for us, and he really liked the way I played drums. So he invited me to play on his solo record. And that turned into me playing in his band Skinyard, which is Skinyard was one of the first early grunge bands, like kind of an art grunge, like King Crimson meets Black Sabbath or something like that. And I did 2 records with Skinyard. We toured Europe on all over the United States, because this was now 1990 when grunge is really taken off.
And what was it? I mean, the stories about that scene, that everybody kind of hung out and everybody borrowed instruments and amps from each other, and everybody played in each other's band. Was it all the way back then like that?
Yeah, and the truth of the matter about the Seattle music scene was that it was it was like a brotherhood of music, and sisterhood too, because there's lots of girls and young women that were playing in really cool, early grunge and punk rock bands. And it was a pretty small scene. Seattle was a small town. We all lived in the city of Seattle. We all knew each other. We all went to each other's shows. And it's just the way it was. Like we were talking about earlier, there's no internet. So the only way you found out about music is if you went to the show. You had to go to the show and see who was playing. And you just would hear a rumor like, oh, it's going to be like a couple guys from Green River, and they're doing this new band, and it's called Mother Love Bone. Well, I have no idea what Mother Love Bone sounds like, but I'm going to go and just see what it is, Or like I saw the very first Tad concert. Tad was like the heaviest band, next to the Melvins, which, they're definitely the heaviest. And so we would just get a rumor like, oh, there's this new band. They're called Mudhoney. Let's go see what they sound like. And it really was like that. People shared a backline, they shared the drums, they shared the amps, and it was like a very large extended family of about maybe 200 people, including the fans. It was the same people at every show, But what's interesting about that is you get I know I'm talking for a long time about this, but I'm just giving you the image of it. There's something really magical that happens when you have like all these people in the same place writing songs and being influenced by each other before it becomes this big global phenomena. And I'm not sure that could have happened if the internet had existed, because the internet shows everything instantly and there's no time for it to ferment and become something. That's just a theory.
I'd love for you to extend on it, because I'm thinking that's almost like the last time in history where some music that kind of music would be considered completely hardcore today. I mean, put any Nirvana album or some of the tracks on Soundgarden, it's almost avant-garde rock now. I mean, it's a very harsh, in your face. Some of it is very dark. Right. Let alone Alice in Chains. I mean, just the idea that music was constantly on the radio, constantly on MTV, is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nothing short of unbelievable.
What's also interesting too is that the sort of, you know, masterpiece albums by those bands are not their first albums.
Yeah,
So you know, Soundgarden, we were talking about Super Unknown earlier. You know, they'd made what they did the what is that, their fourth album? You know, and
yeah.
Bad Motorfinger right before that is also an incredible album. But Super Unknown is the record that like everybody suddenly knows about Soundgarden.
Same
And
for Alice in Chains.
that's right. The Dirt album was their second album, but they did an album and a
Two
couple of
two
EPs.
EPs, yeah, two
Right.
EPs, yeah.
So it and there are other bands that I could name like that. Like the Screaming Trees made 5 albums before Sweet Oblivion became our breakthrough album. So
Yeah.
it does require that you have the opportunity and the time to really work together and work on your songwriting and create albums and get experience doing that before you can make like the big album. And it's very difficult to do that now. Bands are expected their first album has to be a hit or they get dropped.
And I'm also assuming that when they are working together, it's not like you guys in a basement or in someone's shop or whatever. It's people
Right.
with their iPhones like this,
Right.
broadcasting live every little note
Right.
and creating an anagram around it and giveaway around it, and
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah. I know. It's kind of like when okay, like when they released that Lost John Coltrane album, that was
yeah.
great. I loved hearing an album that had never been released. But I don't really care about hearing the outtakes that John Coltrane did. I just want to hear the one that he picked as that's the one I want to be on the album. So and so the internet is like that. You see every mistake and flaw and
Yeah.
you never and that clouds the final perfect thing that you want to say to the world, you know.
I always felt that way about a lot of the bands that we're talking about today. Like we wouldn't be able to go to the shows, but we'll be able to see some videos, or especially nowadays you can see the videos. And oftentimes these guys are, it's not their, it's not their brightest hour for whatever
Right,
reason.
right,
But people lived in the universe where they're not being photographed or videotaped 24/7.
right.
And there's a feeling that I think in jazz and classical you kind of get that a little more nowadays, that you can still play to an audience that listening and not just holding a screen.
Right,
But
right.
but that, I think that's changing, and I can think we can also hear the sound of production changing and distance changing
Yeah.
more and more.
Yeah, I
So
think, yeah, I agree with you. I think if you watch a concert through the screen of your iPhone, you're totally missing the whole point of being in the concert.
exactly, what are we doing
You
here?
know,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean that you're supposed to be there to experience the music and be changed by it. And I think when you if you put a filter in front of your eyes, and that I mean, you're doing yourself a disservice by doing that. Like, show up and experience the music directly. You know, that's the power of it.
That's the
And
point of it. Yeah.
we're also seeing how much we miss music because none of us can tour right now. And you know, I watch my friends when they do a live stream, but you know, it just doesn't have the same effect as being in the room and
Yeah.
feeling it, you know.
I have to, yeah, of course. So was there a moment where you went from, I love playing drums, I love being in bands, I love being in studios, I love touring, but maybe I can also produce?
Well, yeah, I think the fact that Jack and Dino became my first mentor as a producer, I learned so much from working on records with Jack and Dino because Jack produced the Skin Yard records. And then he actually introduced me to Nando Reis in Brazil and produced a few of Nando's records, which I played on. And then at a certain point, I was splitting my time between Seattle and Los Angeles. I lived in both places and I would just kind of go back and forth. And I was getting a lot of studio session work in Los Angeles. And
As
that's
a
where,
drummer?
as a drummer and almost more as a percussionist. So, like, for example, you mentioned Queens of the Stone Age because I played on the Rated R album, but I didn't play the drums. I actually played all of the exotic percussion that you hear on the album. So I played
Yeah, I
like,
was
yeah, it was like vibraphone and marimba and steel drums and doumbek and all the shakers and all that stuff. And that's kind of what gave the album this exotic,
the
kind of
sound.
psychedelic.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
My
I
dad,
wasn't.
my dad asked me, he texted me earlier and he asked me, so who's in the show? Should I tune in? I was like, you're gonna like this guy. He's a drummer and a percussionist. Well, my dad is a
Yeah.
percussionist. So
And as what's interesting about being a drummer and a percussionist, but drummers make good producers because we think about the structure of the song, we think about the arrangement of it, we think about the feel and all of the layers that are going to go on top of it. So I think it's a very good foundation to start from if you want to be a producer. Like, learn how to play the drums, because that's your foundation.
so when you say you learned so much from tracking and recording with Jack and Dino,
Yeah.
just at the top of your head, what did you learn? If you could
Well, I
just like,
learned that you have to have a good drum track to build everything on. And it's really important that your source signals, like, so the sound going into the microphone, going into whether it's a tape machine or hard drive, whatever it is, that signal needs to be as clean and unpolluted as possible. So like when we would record drum tracks, we would record the drums completely wide open, the way they naturally sounded, which means taking the time to tune the drums so that they sound good before you record them. And you don't put any special effects on them until you're mixing. So your source signals are always the original sounds. And then things like,
do
guitars
you
and
like
yeah.
do you
Yeah, go
like
ahead.
recording drums in big rooms, small rooms, what, high ceiling, low ceiling?
Well, of course, the big rooms are great drum sounds just because of the natural reverb of the room. So you place your mics to take advantage of that. But like in my studio here in Olympia, Washington, it's just one large room where I do drums and everything else. I don't have a separate drum room. But I've probably done half and half. I've recorded in the big famous drum rooms like Capitol Studios, the Frank Sinatra studio at Capitol
Yeah.
Records. I did Screaming Trees drum tracks there, and it sounded incredible. And I think it was half because I was recording the drums and looking at the room and going like, wow, that's where Frank Sinatra stood, and that's where the orchestra was. And and so just being in a room like that kind of changes. And we recorded at Electric Ladyland in New York, Jimi Hendrix studio, and it's not a very big studio actually. It's plenty big enough, but it's not some huge studio. It's just like, but Jimi Hendrix stood there, and it just changes how you think about that space. And there is a spiritual component to that, because when you really feel the people that have been in that room and the records they made there, it changes how you play, and that changes the outcome of whatever you're recording.
Of course, of course, of course. But I think that is sometimes that is difficult thing to. It's so non-tangible.
Right.
If I want to get a great drums track on my album, um, or myself as an aspiring producer, it's not as easy to talk about. Try to feel the legends in the room, especially since my room in Berlin, it's the same. It's one big room, but there's no Jimi Hendrix is here. But
Yeah, but
I
you're
did
there.
go.
That's what matters, is you're in there.
It's a start. It's a start.
Right.
So I did get to record at Electric Ladyland, and I did get to record at Rudy Van Gelder's, where all those jazz, Blue Notes, and Coltrane albums, and
You
also
recorded in that house, Rudy Van Gelder.
yeah,
It was
yeah,
his mother's house. Wow.
yeah, and it's not, the mother's house was probably the early 50s.
I know, but I
But
love the story that he's like, Mom, can I record John Coltrane in your living room? It's like
tomorrow, John is coming tomorrow at 4. Will that work with cooking?
yeah,
But
yeah.
so by the mid 50s, he already had a pro studio right by the house.
Right. Okay.
And it's a very high ceiling kind of room.
Okay.
And it's the same in Avatar Studios in New York, which used to be the power station.
Oh, right.
And it's the same in the 30th Street. It's no longer a studio, but I did get to see the place where Columbia and Sony recorded all the classics. So it's going to be Glenn Gould one day and Miles Davis the other day, and then Bob Dylan the next day. And I'm really coming down to the theory where sound needs the sound waves, they need room to kind of move around and bounce around for you to get that sound. And when we record nowadays in smaller rooms, and then we try to add reverb, and it's the reverb kind of, the more reverb we add, the more the instrument seems further away as opposed to present with the presence to them.
Right.
Which is why I'm super curious about what your take on it, because especially the way you guys play and that much energy into the instrument.
Well, that's okay. So kind of a two-part answer to that. The first part is that we have to remember that the human ear is still an analog instrument. So the way that we record, the way that drums sound in a room is a very analog acoustic experience, right? So the human ear can sense that. The human ear is such an evolved, delicate, important part of our biology, and that the ear can hear, like, yeah, that's Art Blakey, because that's who I think of when you talk about room reverb. Art Blakey's drums are loud. I mean, he was not a quiet drummer, he was loud. And it swings, and it has this beautiful room ambience to it. And that's what John Bonham had. Like, those two drummers are really similar.
And I'll say one more thing about what you just said. The human ear, it's not just super delicate. It's also, we also subconsciously decide whether we trust this or we don't trust this emotionally.
I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right. The ear can tell, like, nah, that's like, and you can hear plate reverb, which is the classic reverb that they used, in the old days. But that
the Phil Collins trick.
That's right, and that has a certain quality to it that a plug-in reverb just doesn't have. I mean, plug-in reverb is pretty damn good at this point, but it's still not the same as room reverb or old plate reverb. It just isn't. And then the second part of the question is that, or my answer rather, is that making records is really affected by the economics of the music industry now, right? So when we were making records in the 90s, our recording budgets were like $200,000 or $300,000. I did a session for a band, and their budget was $1 million to make a record. I mean, that's just unheard of now. I mean, who could spend $1 million making a record? It's impossible. Unless you're some huge pop star, but even they are smart and don't do that. But now we're making records in small studios, in home studios, and people make records in their bedrooms, and they just use digital technology to do it. So it's doable, but it doesn't have that same atmosphere as those classic records, which is why we always go back to them.
And I'm also sensing that it changes to, this whole idea of I'll send you tracks and re-record your parts, send it back over. But there, every now and then I hear someone, like there's this guy, Sufjan Stevens. It's basically
Sufjan, yeah.
He's basically a guy in a room with one Shure 58. That's the whole album. Everything is through that. 58 into an M box. 10 albums that are all unbelievable. A million instruments. So I think people find their creative ways around this.
Well, right. That's kind of that's what I'm saying, is that, like, because the economic, bands don't get the kind of advances to make albums that cost $200,000 or $300,000. It just doesn't happen. So you figure out how to make a record, you scale it to whatever your budget is for that album, and you find a way to do it. I mean, it's allowed me to produce records for people with very small budgets, but I can make them sound really good because I have all that experience, producing and playing on records that were really big records. And I remember some of those tricks, like, oh, if you do this, you can get that, and
so let's talk about those tricks. This is what I'm here for. Give me the juice.
Well, for example, you don't need a big room to do a great drum track. You just don't. as long as you use good microphones and and you don't need a whole bunch of microphones either. You don't need, I usually don't use more than about 8 microphones on my drums. And that's just, miking, the kick, the snare, the 3 toms, a couple of room mics, and maybe I'll have one more for, like, if I'm using an interesting piece of percussion on the drum set, then I'll mic that too. But
favorite microphones for drum recordings?
well, you mentioned SHURE 58. I use a SHURE Beta 58 for the top of my snare drum, and I actually learned that from Jack Endino. And he's right. You get the best attack and response on the top of the snare with a Beta 58.
What is the difference between the Beta 58 and the stock
And
58?
a regular 50? I don't know, but there's something
I'm going to find out.
Yeah, there's something about how whatever they did in the technology of the microphone, the Beta 58 is really great for the top of the snare. And then for the bottom of the snare, I would, depending on what studio I might be at, I'll use a 441 for the bottom of the mic, but I've used an SM57 probably more than half the time, because that's just a go-to mic that always sounds good. So I'll put a 57 on the bottom. And then for the toms, I've used 421s, but like right now I'm using Sennheiser 609s, which can be used for guitar amps, but they sound fantastic on toms. Yeah, so I mean, it's all, these are, and then a D112 on the kick. That's just
If we're talking about fantastic guitar mics,
yeah.
I'm kind of repeating myself in every episode, but every time that I work with some, whether it's like a super legendary producer or just like a bunch of guys cracking a demo, and people are starting, they go with the headphones, they put this mic, they move it a little like this, a little bit like that, a little bit like this, and they try to mix this mic with that amp. It's a ribbon and a this, and a ribbon and a that.
Right.
Anytime that someone spends 2 hours and then I stick a 57, almost no matter where I put it, is going to beat out no matter what they tried beforehand. I mean, that microphone to me, it's the simplest mic.
Sure. Yeah, totally.
Anything you put into it, I put it in a piano, it works. I mean,
right. Well, like for example, with guitar production, and I learned this from Jack, because Jack's a guitar player. He's recorded the great guitar players of our generation. Kim Thile, Kurt Cobain, all Gary Lee Conner, all of those guitar players. And I'm just kind of speaking in generalistic terms about this, but he said, we'd use a 57, and he put it just right up on the screen of the amp. And he just said things like, always get your distortion naturally from the amp. Try to, don't use a pedal if you don't need to use a pedal. Try to get it from the amp itself. It's going to be a more authentic, and this is, using old tube analog amps. So you get this natural distortion. And then if you have a whole bunch of pedals, unplug them and only use the pedal that you have to use for that song. Like try to, you know what I mean? Like keep the chain clean, so you don't have a whole bunch of sounds and ambient noise that every pedal creates it, right? So just keep your signal path as clean as possible, and keep your signal as original to the source as possible. Same thing with bass.
Another huge tip that I got over time is, when you're recording guitars, use the shortest cable that you can find. I mean,
yes, I've heard that too.
The shortest that you can.
Yep. Yeah,
I mean, it's a different sound. You can go Jimi Hendrix with the spiral thingy where it's like, like 20 feet.
Right.
But it's a completely different sound. But if you want to get the punch, the shortest cable you can.
Yeah, I think that's true. I've heard that said about microphone cables too. The longer the cable is, the more there is for the sound to dissipate. So keep your cables as short as possible. In other words, this is kind of for whatever the instrument is, capture it in its most essential nature, created by the instrument itself, right on it, and keep that signal path clean. And if you do that, then when you go into the mixing phase, everything is very, very clean, very, very pristine. There's not a lot of extra noise. Then you can start adding in the things you need to add, if you need to add effects and plugins and things like that. But like when I produce a record, until I go to mix it, I don't put any effects on the overdubs. because I want the overdubs to be recorded so well that when I make a rough mix, it should just sound good just like that. The rough mix of the original sound should be good enough that you can hear everything before you even go into the mixing phase.
When you say overdubs, are you in the old days with Mad Season, with Walking Papers, with in all those bands,
Yeah.
did you record the rhythm section in one room live and then added the vocals?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it sounded like to me.
And I was going to say that when you were asking me about Duff McKagan. So he and I were the rhythm section on 2 albums for the Walking Papers. And I've also, like, he and I played on Mark Lanigan's solo,
Yeah.
one of his solo records. So he and I have worked as a rhythm section like many times. And Duff and I always record the drums and the bass live. Because
I can hear it. That's why I asked.
Yes.
It's so audible.
Yeah. And Duff is an incredibly precise bass player, probably the most precise bass player I've ever played with. If he makes a mistake, he figures out what the mistake is, and he doesn't make the mistake again. He's amazing. He's like very, very precise. So by the time we cut the final keeper take, it's like there's not a lot of mistakes. And if there is, we'll listen and we'll pick the one that has the best feel and just punch in that note or that little thing or whatever. But the drum track is a complete linear drum track with no edits. So,
and this is something that you carry to your own production as well.
Yes, I'm working on 2 albums right now at the same time. One of them is one of my records, and one is Joy Harjo, the poet I was telling you about. All the drum tracks, they're all straight, clean drum tracks. There's no edits. It's so the performance is the way I played it. Every now and then there's a little like, oh, that tom is slightly behind the beat. I'm going to live with it because that's the way my spirit performed the drum track. So I never quantize drums. I don't edit them unless there's like some egregious thing that we have to take out. Like suddenly the artist is like, oh, I love that basic track, but we got to get rid of that thing. It's like, okay, we'll edit that. But I try to go with a human complete drum performance. And then one last thing about playing with Duff is that, so when you record the drums and the bass together like that, and Duff has all this natural swing in the way he plays, so you get a rhythm track that has this deep swing that is not edited. It's just the way we played it.
And beautiful. So I could go all night, but I'm kind of going to the last question here, just so I don't, keep you from the rest of your career as I ask along. I'm just gonna run through a few people that had a huge impact on my life and a lot of people's life, and just whatever the situation was like for you, whatever you took musically from the situation, however you want to put it. So the first would be Lane Staley.
Okay, Lane, my first instincts are he's an incredible, beautiful human being, very, very kind and sweet and really funny, like super wicked sense of humor. And as a singer, his vocals were so powerful, and people have said this, but I've experienced it firsthand. When you stood on the side of the stage, like when Alice in Chains played, and the Screaming Trees did a whole world tour with Alice in Chains, so I saw like lots of shows. If you stood on the side of the stage, you could hear his vocals as loud acoustically off his body as it was coming out of the monitors. That's how much power he had behind his voice. It just came out of his whole body, and so you could hear it off the side of the stage as loud as what was coming out of the monitors. And when we did the Mad Season album, he just did these flawless vocal performances, one after another, and he would do all the harmonies and the layers. Like he had it all figured out in his head what he wanted to do, and then he would just go do it. And I've worked with a lot of incredible vocalists, but he had a talent that I've never seen in anybody else.
And that is talent in your eyes?
It's talent and it's soul. It's just kind of like the way his spirit was. He just was like that, he just could do these incredible vocal performances. And although I never recorded with Chris Cornell, I never recorded with him except when we did the Mad Season tribute concert. he had
But
that
he produced your album as well, right?
he
Or no?
produced the Screaming Trees album right before I joined the band. So
Ah,
because I joined the Screaming Trees in 91 and he did that album was 1990. So I knew Chris and, I talked with him a bunch of times, but I never was in a studio with him. But except we recorded that concert at Benaroya Hall, and he had that same thing. Like when he sang, it was just like perfectly in tune, huge power, and it was instantaneous.
unbelievable. Next up is Mike McCready.
Okay, McCready, like also one of my earliest friends, and somebody that I, he would come hang out with the Screaming Trees when we were playing shows before he and I were ever, playing together. So I've known him for a very long time. And same kind of thing. He's like this instantaneous. I mean, I think there's a parallel here. These kinds of musicians have an instantaneous ability to channel their spirit into the instrument. It's just like
I'm
instant.
so happy you used that word because
Yeah.
McCready, I think, channels something. I don't know him
Yeah.
personally, but I'm getting
Yeah.
a sense that he closes his eyes and he's
Yeah.
playing, and
Yeah.
there's something universal there.
Yep. It's
It's no longer a person doing something on an instrument.
That's right. He's just like directly channeling right into his instrument. And Mike has all the great influences. He's influenced by Jimmy and Stevie Ray Vaughan, and he also likes all the hard rock stuff. Like he's very diverse.
But I always get a sense that there's something that he has. There's very few, as a guitarist, I can tell you, very few people has this. Like it's him and Slash, and there's that you no longer see a person playing.
Yeah.
You see a being. You see something, a being channeling something.
Yeah. Well, and I have to say Eddie Van Halen is like that too, man. When I was in high school, I loved I still love Van Halen. I hear Van Halen on the radio and I'm like, man, that is a killer band. It's like the songs are good. Yeah. They just like everything. Everybody in that band was awesome, So
it's easy to forget that Van Halen, it's in its essence, it's kind of like a power trio.
Yeah, essentially.
Yes. It was a trio. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, when you listen to their albums, the rhythm tracks are it's just drums and bass and one guitar.
Exactly. Next coming up is Mark Lanegan.
Lanegan, yes, my old bandmate.
Old buddy.
Bandmate, and yeah, I would say he's an old friend. When you're old friends with somebody, you go through a lot. That's just the way it is. He also incredible singer. I remember when we'd do vocals, he'd get his vocal taken about 3 takes in the studio. He doesn't like to sing it too many times, and within those first 2 or 3 takes, he usually has it. And obviously the timbre of his voice is what makes him so unique. Nobody has a voice that deep.
Yeah.
So I will say this, I really love the way he's experimenting with his voice and non-traditional instrumentation on his solo records, using electronics and sequences and like I would have never guessed that, when I started working with him 30 years ago, but it's really cool the way he's doing it now.
Unbelievable. Yeah. Unbelievable. Michael Stipe, let's touch a little bit on that as well.
Yeah, Michael Stipe. Yeah, these are all the great singers that, that I've got to work with.
Pretty much.
Yeah, Michael Stipe, same thing. He's just got this incredible voice. And what I loved about when I was working on those REM albums is that he would type his lyrics on pieces of paper, and he'd put them on the walls of the control room so that we could all see the evolution of his lyrics as we're working on the songs. And it was really beautiful to like listen. We'd be hearing the playbacks of the rhythm tracks, and then I'd walk over to the wall and I'd see his lyric sheet, and I'd be like, oh yeah, I see what he's doing. I see the evolution of the song. And then of course when he sings, he's just an incredible performer. I mean, he just like knocks it out of the park. And it's like I said earlier, he's one of those guys, he can sing the phone book and it sounds great. Just whatever he sings, it just naturally sounds good.
And where do you think that comes from?
Man, all these people you're talking about, or that we're talking about, they're just incredibly talented. Like they're born with the talent, but then also they've made multiple albums. I mean, like not just a couple or a handful of albums, but like we're talking like 10, 12, 15, 20 albums. And when you make that many records, you just get really, really good at it. I mean, I've played on over 100 albums, but just throughout my career, like with all the different people I played with. And if you play on that many albums, you just kind of start to, you understand how albums are made and all these little, the ins and outs of it, and the tricks and the layers and the techniques, and it just becomes a second nature to you. So, you know, singers like the ones we're talking about, these are the greatest singers of the, you know, the last like 30 years, maybe 40 years of rock and roll. Those are the singers. Of course, there are others that are just as good as that, but the ones you're naming are up there.
So let's also talk about Nando, which is not as
Nando.
well.
Okay, so Nando's whole thing is that he is a great singer, but he is the first to say that he had to really work on his singing over the course of his career. But what he's known for is his incredible songwriting. You know, so he's like one of those guys, he wrote all these hit songs for other Brazilian singers that had just magnificent voices. And they would always go to Nando to have him write a song because he's such a good poet. And, you know, the Portuguese language, you know, like all the romantic languages, has this incredible, like the sounds of the words and the metaphors and all of that is really, really powerful, which is why in Brazil, the Brazilian songwriters are so revered. So he has that ability to write these incredible songs. And then now that he's a solo artist, he just sings his own songs.
And did you expect the album to be such a big deal, or were you just working in it? It's just like another day in the studio, or?
Well, that particular album, at that point I'd played on 4 or 5 of Nando's albums. I'd never produced any albums of his until that album, but I played, you know, a lot of instruments. You know, I played drums, upright bass, vibraphone, you know, like a lot of layers on his albums. So by the time we produced that album, which was called Jardim Pomar, which means garden orchard in Portuguese, we had a long working relationship. And so, but I did, you know, I did the smart Seattle thing, which is like bring in all the great Seattle musicians to play on a Brazilian rock album. So he has this incredible band of Brazilian musicians, but I brought in McCready to play a guitar solo and he nailed it. He knocked it out of the park. I brought in Peter Buck to play some 12-string guitar and mandolin. And we used a bunch of Seattle horn, like jazz horn players that I work with, and we had them do horn arrangements. And so I kind of stacked the deck a little bit.
Unbelievable.
But of course, you never know how well an album's going to do until it comes out. I never thought that it would win a Grammy. I didn't even think about it. You know, it was amazing I was amazed when we got the nomination, and then I was blown away when we won it. You know, it's like each layer of it was like, what? Really? Okay. But
wow.
But the way you just go into it making the best record you could possibly make. You just do that. If it wins an award, great. But the most important thing is you just do the best job you can do.
So what's next for you?
Well, I mean, until things change, you know, politically and with the virus and everything. I mean, I think my wife and I, we live in Olympia, Washington. My wife has a book coming out. I have another book coming out. I've got multiple albums in different stages of production. But I hope that by the spring or summer of next year that I'll be playing shows again. with either my own solo group, which is just called the Barrett Martin Group, or I'll be working with other people that I'm currently producing.
Beautiful.
But we don't know, you know. What are you going to be doing? You've got a beautiful album. What are you going to tour? What's your plan?
The truth is that we're trying to we were just trying to set up another tour here where Europe was kind of starting to open up for a second.
Right.
I had like a very extensive tour lineup for April, May, June, July, and then it went the way it did. And we're looking to book things now, but it's so hard to kind of understand which countries are letting who in, and it's kind of difficult. I'm doing a few things with some guys here. We're only being here in Berlin for 1 year, so I'm kind of learning the scene still. But I got a band here that's like the guys here. One of them I know from New York for many, many years. And we're doing some live streams from here. We're doing one for Scholars in Boston. We're doing one for the Blue Note in New York, and we'll be doing some others. But it doesn't. I'm not that excited about playing in front of a lens. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Like I really wish we could have this talk in person over some coffee or some wine. You know,
someday we will. We will.
There you go. But I'm a tangible guy. I want to hear the amp in the room, and I want to see you in the flesh, and I want to taste the soup while it's hot. So playing this whole let's stream everything it's kind of missing the mark on me, to be honest.
Well, you are in a great, I mean, Berlin is an amazing city. I've been there many times, and there's a whole bunch of great American musicians. I think a lot of jazz musicians that live there that moved over there years ago. Like there was a great drummer named Earl Harvin, who was, I can't remember what city he was based in, but I used to see him all the time in Seattle. And I know he moved over there. And I've just heard of a lot of American and European musicians moving to Berlin. So hopefully you have a great scene there.
There's a lot of cats here, but speaking about drummers, there's something about American drummers. It could be, and I think it's mostly about the Black American music.
Right. Yes. I mean, that's the foundation of it right there.
Yeah. So it seems like anywhere in the world that you go, you have people playing Black American drumming, just not as good. Seems to me.
Right.
But also because I kind of grew up in New York playing with the real thing. With the legends. Yeah. So Barrett, thank you so much for coming. Really, I learned a lot, but I mostly just had the best time.
Man, I enjoyed this conversation. This was good. It was just back and forth, really good. I like the most, because I learned when I talk to other people too. You know, I'm just hearing, because I pick up on what you're perceiving. So it's awesome.
Thank you. It means the world to me that we finally got to this. Anyone who's watching, go to barrettmartin.com and check out what he's working on. Next week we have with us the great producer Stephen Lipson, Paul McCartney, Annie Lennox, Rod Stewart. He's kind of a legend, so we're really looking forward to that. So we'll see you next Tuesday at the same time. And thanks so much for having us. Stay safe and stay cool, Barrett. And I'll see you real soon.